This midday, much of the world is watching Minneapolis as we await a verdict in the murder trial of Derek Chauvin. Thanks for joining us. I'm Jason Whiteley. As we speak here in the 11 o'clock hour, jurors are in the middle of their first full day of deliberations. And security has stepped up there in Minneapolis in anticipation of that verdict, which could come at any time. Yesterday, the prosecution and defense gave closing arguments. The prosecution reminding jurors that this is a case against one police officer, not the entire department. Here's ABC's Rena Roy with the latest from Minneapolis.
It feels like everyone here in this city and really across the country is just holding their breath, waiting for a verdict. The jury's first full day of deliberations now underway. Tuesday, all eyes on the 12 jurors responsible for deciding Derek Chauvin's fate.
It is your duty to decide the questions of fact in this case.
The diverse jury, ages ranging from 20s to 60s, 5 men and 7 women, 4 black, 6 white, and 2 self-identify as multiracial. They heard nearly 3 weeks of testimony from 45 witnesses and 6 hours of closing arguments from both sides Monday.
Mr. Chauvin should be found not guilty of all counts.
What the defendant did to George Floyd killed him.
Prosecutors arguing Chauvin used unreasonable, deadly force even as bystanders begged him to stop and then failed to render medical aid.
For 9 minutes and 29 seconds, the defendant's weight on him, desperately crying out. A grown man crying out for his mother.
The defense blaming George Floyd's drug use and heart issues for his death, saying Chauvin did what he was trained to do.
And a reasonable police officer would consider whether to use an additional force to overcome the suspect's level of resistance.
In rebuttal, the prosecution leaving jurors with these final words.
You were told, for example, that Mr. Floyd died because his heart was too big. And the truth of the matter is that the reason George Floyd is dead is because Mr. Chauvin's heart was too small.
Outside the courthouse, hundreds of protesters demanding justice for George Floyd. Ahead of the verdict, businesses boarded up, National Guard members on standby, and local schools going remote starting Wednesday. The governor here says civil unrest cannot be allowed, but that communities in pain need to be heard and that systemic change needs to happen. Rena Roy, ABC News, Minneapolis.
So right now it's up to the 7 women and 5 men on the jury to decide Chauvin's fate, and we'll dive deeper into those who make up this jury a little later in our newscast. But first, let's get an attorney's perspective as these deliberations continue this midday. Quentin Brogdon is an attorney here in Dallas with CBR Law Firm. Quentin, thanks for the time this midday. We appreciate you being here.
Good morning, Jason. Not since the OJ trial in the 90s has the attention of the world been so fixated on one trial.
Indeed it is. And we say the world, we're not, being hyperbolic with any of that either. We saw these protests erupt last year across the country and around the world after what happened to George Floyd. But the million-dollar question right now is how long will deliberations last? I realize that question, can't be answered exactly, but based on what we heard in the trial, is this a complex case like the defense suggests, or is it much simpler like the prosecution argued?
It's always dangerous to handicap a case and what a jury's going to do. But we know here, because from the reports of what we've seen and the broadcasting of the trial, in fact, that the prosecution here has put on a very compelling case. They've been aided by an extraordinary amount of video evidence of Chauvin's knee being on Floyd's neck for 9.5 minutes. Video evidence of bystanders and other police raising questions about whether Floyd should be allowed to breathe or get up. And also the testimony of experts, including Chauvin's own police chief, that the use of force here was unreasonable. So all of those things come together to create a very compelling case for the prosecution. Nevertheless, we need to remember that the defense needs only one juror to say, I think there's a reasonable doubt, and then Chauvin walks.
Well, let's talk about that for a moment, Quentin. The defense did raise the question of reasonable doubt and reminded jurors of the medical examiner's testimony. He said there were several contributing factors to George Floyd's death, including drugs and pre-existing conditions. How effective will that be, do you think?
Well, ultimately, under the law, Chauvin's actions need to be a substantial factor, that's the legal term, in bringing about Floyd's death. And just because I have a heart condition that may one day kill me, if somebody takes an act that speeds my death and causes my death on a specific day because of their specific act, it's hard to argue that it was my heart condition that killed me under the substantial factor test in the law. So that's what the defense is having to fight and counter here. The argument that, well, he had pre-existing conditions. Everybody has some of some kind that may one day kill us, but it was Chauvin choking the life out of him, asphyxiating him, that killed him. That's the prosecution argument, and it's a compelling one.
And as far as prosecutors go, they kept circling back to the video, telling the jury to trust their eyes, especially there in closing arguments. How impactful is that if you're sitting on a jury?
Video and photographs are always very compelling evidence for jurors. It's one thing for lawyers to argue, it's one thing for witnesses to describe something, but when jurors are able to see it in a video, in particular when it's alive and coming in real time, it's very hard to counter what the jurors decide it means. The defense have argued essentially the 9.5 minutes, you need to put that in the context of the 16 minutes before, where Floyd is resisting and things are going on. The crowd, according to them, is getting hostile. But the jurors may look at that video and decide on their own that it means something entirely different, and that Chauvin acted unreasonably.
And Quentin, final moments here too. You watch this trial, you have a lot of legal experience. Any guesses on which way this might go? Who made the better case?
It's always dangerous to handicap, and I make it a matter of principle not to try and get in the middle of it. I will say again, though, the prosecution made a very compelling case. It's unusual to have this much video, and it's certainly unusual to have the police chief or the officer who's on trial testifying the officer acted unreasonably.
Yeah.
So it's a tough road to hoe for the defense here.
Indeed, that is unusual to see the police chief take the stand like that. We appreciate your time. Quentin Brogdon, a local attorney here from CBR Law Firm. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jason. This isn't going away anytime soon.
No, sir, I don't think it is. And we want to remind you that when the jury announces that it has reached a verdict, you can count on us to deliver the news on air and online. ABC will also have a special report on air. And of course, we are on all the time at WFAA.com.